Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories on YouTube. Tonight, we return to Cornwall with The Mermaid's Vengeance, as collected and edited by Robert Hunt. This story comes from Hunt's Popular Romances of the West of England, The Drolls, Traditions, and Superstitions of Old Cornwall, published in 1865. Unlike some of our other stories, the title of this one really sets it up beautifully, so we'll hop right in with one brief comment. The male characters in this story are often referred to by their surnames, while the female characters are referred to by their first names. This can be confusing the first couple of times it happens before we get all the characters straight. So now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Several versions of the following story have been given me. The general idea of the tale belongs to the North Coast, but the fact of mermaidens taking innocents under their charge was common around the Lizard and in some of the coves near the Land's End. In one of the deep valleys of the parish of Perenzabulo, which are remarkable for their fertility, and especially for the abundance of fruit which the orchards produce, lived, in days long ago, amidst a rudely civilized people, a farmer's laborer, his wife, with one child, a daughter. The man and woman were equally industrious. The neatly whitewashed walls of their mud-built cottage, the well-kept gravelled paths and carefully weeded beds of their small garden, in which flowers were cultivated for ornament and vegetables for use, proclaimed at once the character of the inmates. In contrast with the neighboring cottages, this one, although smaller than many others, had a superior aspect, and the occupiers of it exhibited a strong contrast to those peasants and miners amidst whom they dwelt. Penna, as the man was called, or Penna the Proud, as he was in no very friendly spirit, named by his less thoughtful and more impulsive fellows, was, as we have said, a farmer's laborer. His master was a wealthy yeoman, and he, after many years' experience, was so convinced of the exceeding industry and sterling honesty of Penna that he made him the manager of an outlying farm in this parish under the Hind, or Hine, the Saxon pronunciation is still retained in the west of England, or general supervisor of this and numerous other extensive farms. Penna was too great a favourite with the squire to be a favourite of the Hinds, and he was evidently jealous of him, and from not being himself a man of very strict principles, he hated the unobtrusive goodness of his underling, and was constantly on the watch to discover some cause of complaint. It was not, however, often that he was successful in this. Every task committed to the care of Penna, and he was often purposely overtasked, was executed with great care and dispatch. With the wife of Penna, however, the case was unfortunately different. Honor Penna was as industrious as her husband, and to him she was in all respects a helpmate. She had, however, naturally a proud spirit, and this had been encouraged in her youth by her parents. Honor was very pretty as a girl, and indeed she retained much beauty as a woman. The only education she received was the wild one of experience, and this within a very narrow circle. She grew, an ignorant girl, amongst ignorant men and women, few of them being able to write their names and scarcely any of them to read. There was much native grace about her, and she was flattered by the young men and envied by the young women of the village, the envy and the flattery being equally pleasant to her. In the same village was born and brought up Tom Chenalls, who had, in the course of years, become hind to the squire. Tom, as a young man, had often expressed himself fond of Honor, but he was always distasteful to the village maiden, and eventually, while yet young, she was married to Penna, who came from the southern coast, bringing with him the recommendation of being a stranger, and an exceedingly hard-working man who was certain to earn bread and something more for his wife and family. In the relations in which these people were now placed toward each other, Chenalls had the opportunity of acting ungenerously towards the Pennas. The man bore this uncomplainingly, but the woman frequently quarrelled with him whom she felt was an enemy and whom she still regarded but as her equal. Chinalls was a skilled farmer, and hence was of considerable value to the squire, but although he was endured for his farming knowledge and his business habits, he was never a favourite with his employer. Penna, on the contrary, was an especial favourite, and the evidences of this were so often brought strikingly under the observation of Chinalls that it increased the irritation of his hate, for it amounted to that. For years things went on thus. There was the tranquil suffering of an oppressed spirit manifested in Penna, the angry words and actions of his wife toward the oppressor, and, at the same time, as she with much fondness studied to make their humble home comfortable for her husband, she reviled him not unfrequently for the meek spirit with which he endured his petty but still trying wrongs. The hind dared not venture on any positive act of wrong toward these people, yet he lost no chance of annoying them, knowing that the squire's partiality for Penna would not allow him to venture beyond certain bounds, even in this direction. Penna's solace was his daughter. She had now reached her 18th year, and, with the well-developed form of a woman, she united the simplicity of a child. Selena, as she was named, was in many respects beautiful. Her features were regular, and had they been lighted up with more mental fire, they would have been beautiful. But the constant repose, the want of animation, left her face merely a pretty one. Her skin was beautifully white and transparent to the blue veins which traced their ways beneath it, to the verge of that delicacy which indicates disease, but it did not pass that verge. Selena was full of health, as her well-molded form at once showed, and her clear blue eye distinctly told. At times there was a lovely tint upon the cheek, not the hectic of consumptive beauty, but a pure, rosy dye suffused by the healthy life stream when it flowed the fastest. The village gossips, who were always busy with their neighbors, said strange things of this girl. Indeed, it was commonly reported that the real child of the Pennas was a remarkably plain child, in every respect a different being from Selena. The striking difference between the infant and the woman was variously explained by the knowing ones. Two stories were, however, current for miles around the country. One was that Selena's mother was constantly seen gathering dew in the morning with which to wash her child, and that the fairies on the Towns had, in pure malice, aided her in giving a temporary beauty to the girl that it might lead to her betrayal into crime. Why this malice was never clearly made out. The other story was that Honor Penna constantly bathed the child in a certain pool amidst the arched rocks of Perrin, which was a favorite resort of the mermaids. That on one occasion the child, as if in a paroxysm of joy, leapt from her arms into the water and disappeared. The mother, as may well be supposed, suffered a momentary agony of terror, but presently the babe swam up to the surface of the water, its little face more bright and beautiful than it had ever been before. Great was the mother's joy, and also, as the gossips say, great her surprise at the sudden change in the appearance of her offspring. The mother knew no difference in the child whom she pressed lovingly to her bosom, but all the aged crones in the parish declared it to be a changeling. This tale lived its day, but as the girl grew on to womanhood and showed none of the special qualifications belonging to either fairies or mermaids, it was almost forgotten. The uncomplaining father had solace for all his sufferings in wandering over the beautiful sands with his daughter. Whether it was when the summer seas fell in musical undulations on the shore, or when, stirred by the winter tempests, the great Atlantic waves came up in grandeur and lashed the resisting sands in giant rage, these two enjoyed the solitude. Hour after hour, from the setting sun time until the clear cold moon flooded the ocean with her smiles of light, would the father and child walk these sands. They never seemed to weary of them and the ocean. Almost every morning, throughout the milder seasons, Selena was in the habit of bathing, and wild tales were told of the frantic joy with which she would play with the breaking billows, sometimes floating over and almost dancing on the crests of the waves, at other times rushing under them and allowing the breaking waters to beat her to the sands as though they were loving arms endeavoring to encircle her form. Certain it is that Selena greatly enjoyed her bath, but all the rest must be regarded as the creations of the imagination. The most eager to give a construction unfavorable to the simple mortality of the maiden was, however, compelled to acknowledge that there was no evidence in her general conduct to support their surmises. Selena, as an only child, fared the fate of others who were unfortunately so placed, and was, as the phrase is, spoiled. She certainly was allowed to follow her own inclinations without any check. Still, her inclinations were bounded to working in the garden and to leading her father to the seashore. Honor Penna sometimes, it is true, did complain that Selena could not be trusted with the most ordinary domestic duty. Beyond this, there was one other cause of grief. That was the increasing dislike which Selena exhibited toward entering a church. The girl, notwithstanding the constant excuses of being sick, suffering from headache, having a pain in her side, and the like, was often taken, notwithstanding, by her mother to the church. It is said that she always shuddered as she passed the church stile, and again on stepping from the porch into the church itself. When once within the house of prayer, she evinced no particular liking or disliking, observing respectfully all the rules during the performance of the church service, and generally sleeping, or seeming to sleep, during the sermon. Selena Pennaluna had reached her 18th year. She was admired by many of the young men of the parish, but, as if surrounded by a spell, she appeared to keep them all at a distance from her. About this time, a nephew to the squire, a young soldier who had been wounded in the wars, came into Cornwall to heal his wounds and recover health which had suffered in a trying campaign. This young man, Walter Trewoof, was a rare specimen of manhood. Even now, shattered as he was by the combined influences of wounds, an unhealthy climate, and dissipation, he could not but be admired for fineness of form, dignity of carriage, and masculine beauty. It was, however, but too evident that this young man was his own idol, and that he expected everyone to bow down with him and worship it. His uncle was proud of Walter, and although the old gentleman could not fail to see many faults, yet he regarded them as the follies of youth, and trusted their correction with the increase of years and experience. Walter, who was really suffering severely, was ordered by his surgeon, at first, to take short walks on the seashore, and, as he gained strength, to bathe. He was usually driven in his uncle's pony carriage to the edge of the sands. Then, dismounting, he would walk for a short time, and, quickly wearying, return in his carriage to the luxuriant couches at the manor house. On some of these occasions, Walter had observed the father and daughter taking their solitary ramble. He was struck with the quiet beauty of the girl, and seized an early opportunity of stopping Penna to make some general inquiry respecting the bold and beautiful coast. From time to time they thus met, and it would have been evident to any observer that Walter did not so soon weary of the sands as formerly, and that Selena was not displeased with the flattering things he said to her. Although the young soldier had hitherto led a wild life, it would appear as if, for a considerable period, the presence of goodness had repressed every tendency to evil in his ill-regulated heart. He continued, therefore, for some time, playing with his own feelings and those of the childlike being who presented so much of romance, combined with the most homely tameness of character. Selena, it is true, had never yet seen Walter except in the presence of her father, and it is questionable if she had ever for one moment had a warmer feeling than that of the mere pleasure, a silent pride, that a gentleman at once so handsome, so refined, and the nephew of her father's master should pay her any attention. Evil eyes were watching with wicked earnestness the growth of passion, and designing hearts were beating quicker with a consciousness that they should eventually rejoice in the downfall of innocence. Tom Chenals hoped that he might achieve a triumph if he could but once asperse the character of Selena. He took his measures accordingly. Having noticed the change in the general conduct of his master's nephew, he argued that this was due to the refining influence of a pure mind acting on one more than ordinarily impressionable to either evil or good. Walter rapidly recovered health, and with renewed strength the manly energy of his character began to develop itself. He delighted in horse exercise, and Chenals always had the best horse on the farms at his disposal. He was a good shot, and Chenals was his guide to the best shooting grounds. He sometimes fished, and Chenals knew exactly where the choicest trout and the richest salmon were to be found. In fact, Chenals entered so fully into the tastes of the young man that Walter found him absolutely necessary to him to secure the enjoyments of a country life. Having established this close intimacy, Chenals never lost an opportunity of talking with Walter respecting Selena Penna. He soon satisfied himself that Walter, like most other young men who had led a dissipated life, had but a very low estimate of women generally. Acting upon this, he at first insinuated that Selena's innocence was but a mask, and at length he boldly assured Walter that the cottage girl was to be won by him with a few words, and that then he might put her aside at any time as a prize to some low-born peasant. Chenals never failed to impress on Walter the necessity of keeping his uncle in the most perfect darkness and of blinding the eyes of Selena's parents. Penna was, so thought Chenals, easily managed, but there was more to be feared from the wife. Walter, however, with much artifice, having introduced himself to honor Penna, employed the magic of that flattery which, being properly applied, seldom fails to work its way to the heart of a weak-minded woman. He became an especial favorite with honor, and the blinded mother was ever pleased at the attention bestowed with so little assumption, as she thought, of pride on her daughter by one so much above them. Walter eventually succeeded in separating occasionally, although not often, Penna and his daughter. The witching whispers of unholy love were poured into the trusting ear. Guileless herself, this child woman suspected no guile in others, least of all in one whom she had been taught to look upon as a superior being to herself. Amongst the villagers, the constant attention of Walter Trewoof was the subject of gossip, and many an old proverb was quoted by the elder women ill-naturedly and implying that evil must come of this intimacy. Tom Chenals was now employed by Walter to contrive some means by which he could remove Penna, for a period, from home. He was not long in doing this. He lent every power of his wicked nature to aid the evil designs of the young soldier, and thus he brought about that separation of father and child which ended in her ruin. Near the Land's End, the squire possessed some farms, and one of them was reported to be in such a state of extreme neglect, through the drunkenness and consequent idleness of the tenant, that Chenals soon obtained permission to take the farm from the occupier, which he did in the most unscrupulous disregard for law or right. It was then suggested that the only plan by which a desirable occupier could be found would be to get the farm and farm buildings into good condition, and that Penna, of all men, would be the man to bring this quickly about. The squire was pleased with the plan. Penna was sent for by him, and was proud of the confidence which his master reposed in him. There was some sorrow on his leaving home. He subsequently said that he had many warnings not to go, but felt that he dared not disoblige a master who had trusted him so far. So he went. Walter needed not any urging on the part of Chenals, although he was always ready to apply the spur when there was the least evidence of the sense of right asserting itself in the young man's bosom. Week after week passed on. Walter had rendered himself a necessity to Selena. Without her admirer, the world was cold and colorless. With him, all was sunshine and glowing tints. 3 months passed this way, and during that period it had only been possible for Penna to visit his home twice. The father felt that something like a spirit of evil stood between him and his daughter. There was no outward evidence of any change, but there was an inward sense, undefined yet deeply felt, like an overpowering fear, that some wrong had been done. On parting, Penna silently but earnestly prayed that the deep dread might be removed from his mind. There was an aged fisherman who resided in a small cottage built on the sands, who possessed all the superstitions of his class. This old man had formed a father's liking for this simple-hearted maiden, and he had persuaded himself that there really was some foundation for the tales which the gossips told. To the fisherman, Walter Trewoof was an evil genius. He declared that no good ever came to him if he met Walter when he was about to go to sea. With this feeling, he curiously watched the young man and maiden, and he, in after days, stated his conviction that he had seen merry maidens rising from the depth of the waters and floating under the billows to watch Selena and her lover. He has also been heard to say that on more than one occasion, Walter himself had been terrified by sights and sounds. Certain, however, it is, these were insufficient, and the might of evil passions were more powerful than any of the protecting influences of the unseen world. Another 3 months had gone by, and Walter Trewoof had disappeared from Paranzabulo. He had launched into the gay world of the metropolis, and rarely, if ever, dreamed of the deep sorrow which was weighing down the heart he had betrayed. Penna returned home. His task was done, and Chenals had no reason for keeping him any longer from his wife and daughter. Clouds gathered slowly but unremittingly around him. His daughter retired into herself, no longer, as of old, reposing her whole soul on her father's heart. His wife was somewhat changed too. She had some secret in her heart which she feared to tell. The home he had left was not the home to which he had returned. It soon became evident that some shock had shaken the delicate frame of his daughter. She pined rapidly, and Penna was awakened to the knowledge of the cause by the rude rejoicing of Chenals, who declared that all people who kept themselves so much above other people were sure to be pulled down. On one occasion, he so far tempted Penna with sneers at his having hoped to secure the young squire for a son-in-law that the long-enduring man broke forth and administered a severe blow upon his tormentor. This was duly reported to the squire, and added thereto was a magnified story of a trap which had been set by the Pennas to catch young Walter. It was represented that even now they intended to press their claims on account of grievous wrongs upon them, whereas it could be proved that Walter was guiltless, that he was indeed the innocent victim of designing people who thought to make money out of their assumed misfortune. The squire made his inquiries, and there were not a few who eagerly seized the opportunity to gain the friendship of Chenals by representing this family to have been hypocrites of the deepest dye, and the poor girl especially was now loaded with the weight of iniquities of which she had no knowledge. All this ended in the dismissal of Penna from the squire's service, and in his being deprived of the cottage in which he had taken so much pride. Although thrown out upon the world a disgraced man, Penna faced his difficulties manfully. He cast off, as it were, the primitive simplicity of his character, and evidently worked with a firm resolve to beat down his sorrows. He was too good a workman to remain long unemployed, and although his new home was not his happy home as of old, there was no repining heard from his lips. Weaker and weaker grew Selena, and it soon became evident to all that if she came from a spirit world, to a spirit world she must soon return. Grief filled the hearts of her parents. It prostrated her mother, but the effects of severe labor and the efforts of a settled mind appeared to tranquilize the breast of her father. Time passed on, the wounds of the soul grew deeper, and there lay on a low bed from which she had not the strength to move the fragile form of youth with the countenance of age. The body was almost powerless, but there beamed from the eye the evidences of a spirit getting free from the chains of clay. The dying girl was sensible of the presence of creations other than mortal, and with these she appeared to hold converse and to derive solace from the communion. Penna and his wife alternately watched through the night hours by the side of their loved child, and anxiously did they mark the moment when the tide turned, in the full belief that she would be taken from them when the waters of the ocean began to recede from the shore. Thus days passed on, and eventually the sunlight of a summer morning shone in through the small window of this humble cottage on a dead mother and a living babe. The dead was buried in the churchyard on the sands, and the living went on their ways, some rejoicingly and some in sorrow. Once more Walter Trewoof appeared in Perrin on the sands. Penna would have sacrificed him to his hatred. He emphatically protested that he had lived only to do so, but the good priest of the oratory contrived to lay the devil who had possession, and to convince Penna that the Lord would, in his own good time and in his own way, avenge the bitter wrong. Tom Chenals had his hour of triumph, but from the day on which Selena died, everything went wrong. The crops failed, the cattle died, haystacks and cornricks caught fire, cows slipped their calves, horses fell lame or stumbled and broke their knees. A succession of evils steadily pursued him. Trials find but a short resting place with the good. They may be bowed to the earth with the weight of a sudden sorrow, but they look to heaven and their elasticity is restored. The evil-minded are crushed at once and grovel on the ground in irredeemable misery. That Chenals fled to drink in his troubles appeared but the natural result to a man of his character. This unfitted him for his duties, and he was eventually dismissed from his situation. Notwithstanding that the squire refused to listen to the appeals in favor of Chenals, which were urged upon him by Walter, and that indeed he forbade his nephew to countenance that scoundrel in any way, Walter still continued his friend. By his means Tom Chenals secured a small cottage on the cliff, and around it a little cultivated ground, the produce of which was his only visible means of support. That lonely cottage was the scene, however, of drunken carousals, and there the vicious young men and the no less vicious young women of the district went after nightfall and kept high carnival of sin. Walter Trewoof came frequently among them, and as his purse usually defrayed the costs of a debauch, he was regarded by all with especial favor. One midnight, Walter, who had been dancing and drinking for some hours, left the cottage, wearied with his excesses, and, although not drunk, he was much excited with wine. His pathway lay along the edge of the cliffs, amidst bushes of furze and heath, and through several irregular, zigzag ways. There were lateral paths striking off from one side of the main path and leading down to the seashore. Although it was moonlight, without being actually aware of the error, Walter wandered into one of those, and before he was awake to his mistake, he found himself on the sands. He cursed his stupidity, and, uttering a blasphemous oath, he turned to retrace his steps. The most exquisite music which ever flowed from human lips fell on his ear. He paused to listen, and, collecting his unbalanced thoughts, he discovered that it was the voice of a woman singing a melancholy dirge.
The stars are beautiful when bright. They are mirrored in the sea, but they are pale beside that light which was so beautiful to me. My angel child, my earth-born girl, from all your kindred riven, by the base deeds of a selfish churl, and to a sand grave driven. How shall I win thee back to ocean? How canst thou quit thy grave, to share again the sweet emotion of gliding through the wave?
Walter, led by the melancholy song, advanced slowly along the sands. He discovered that the sweet, soft sounds proceeded from the other side of a mass of rocks which project far out over the sands, and that now, at low water, there was no difficulty in walking around it. Without hesitation he did so, and he beheld, sitting at the mouth of a cavern, one of the most beautiful women he had ever beheld. She continued her song, looking upward to the stars, not appearing to notice the intrusion of a stranger. Walter stopped and gazed on the lovely image before him with admiration and wonder mingled with something of terror. He dared not speak, but fixed as if by magic, he stood gazing on. After a few minutes, the maiden, suddenly perceiving that a man was near her, uttered a piercing shriek and made as if to fly into the cavern. Walter sprang forward and seized her by the arm, exclaiming, "Not yet, my pretty maiden, not yet." She stood still in the position of flight, with one arm behind her, grasped by Walter, and, turning round her head, her dark eyes beamed with unnatural luster upon him. Impressionable he had ever been, but never had he experienced anything so entrancing and at the same time so painful as that gaze. It was Selena's face looking lovingly upon him, but it seemed to possess some new power, a might of mind from which he felt it was impossible for him to escape. Walter slackened his hold and slowly allowed the arm to fall from his hand. The maiden turned fully round upon him.
"Go,"
she said. He could not move.
"Go, man,"
she repeated. He was powerless.
"Go to the grave where the sinless one sleepeth. Bring her cold corse where her guarding one weepeth. Look on her, love her again, I betray her, and wreathe with false smiles the pale face of her slayer. Go, go now, and feel the full force of my sorrow. For the glut of my vengeance there cometh a morrow."
Walter was statue-like, and he awoke from this trance-like state only when the waves washed his feet, and he became aware that even now it was only by wading through the waters that he could return around the point of rocks. He was alone. He called. No one answered. He sought wildly as far as he now dared amidst the rocks, but the lovely woman was nowhere to be discovered. There was no real danger on such a night as this, therefore Walter walked fearlessly through the gentle waves and recovered the pathway up from the sands. More than once he thought he heard a rejoicing laugh which was echoed in the rocks, but no one was to be seen. Walter reached his home and bed, but he found no sleep, and in the morning he arose with a sense of wretchedness which was entirely new to him. He feared to make any one of his rough companions a confidant, although he felt this would have relieved his heart. He therefore nursed the wound which he now felt until a bitter remorse clouded his existence. After some days he was impelled to visit the grave of the lost one, and in the fullness of the most selfish sorrow he sat on the sands and shed tears. The priest of the oratory observed him, and, knowing Walter Trewoof, hesitated not to inquire into his cause of sorrow. His heart was opened to the holy man, and the strange tale was told, the only result being that the priest felt satisfied it was but a vivid dream which had resulted from a brain overexcited by drink. He, however, counseled the young man, giving him some religious instruction, and dismissed him with his blessing. There was relief in this. For some days Walter did not venture to visit his old haunt, the cottage of Drolls. Since he could not be lost to his companions without greatly curtailing their vicious enjoyment, he was hunted up by Drolls and again enticed within the circle. His absence was explained on the plea of illness. Walter was, however, an altered man. There was not the same boisterous hilarity as formerly. He no longer abandoned himself without restraint to the enjoyments of the time. If he ever, led on by his thoughtless and rough-natured friends, assumed for a moment his usual mirth, it was checked by some invisible power. On such occasions he would turn deadly pale, look anxiously around, and fall back as if ready to faint on the nearest seat. Under these influences he lost his health. His uncle, who was really attached to his nephew, although he regretted his dissolute conduct, became now seriously alarmed. Physicians were consulted in vain. The young man pined, and the old gossips came to the conclusion that Walter Trewoof was ill-wished, and there was a general feeling that Penna, or his wife, was at the bottom of it. Walter living really on one idea, and that one the beautiful face, which was, and yet was not, that of Selena, resolved again to explore the spot in which he had met this strange being of whom nothing could be learned by any of the covert inquiries he made. He lingered long ere he could resolve on the task, but, wearied, worn by the oppression of one undefined idea in which an intensity of love was mixed with a shuddering fear, he at last gathered sufficient courage to seize an opportunity for again going to the cavern. On this occasion, there being no moon, the night was dark, but the stars shone brightly from a sky cloudless, save a dark mist which hung heavily over the western horizon. Every spot of the ground being familiar to him who, boy and man, had traced it over many times, the partial darkness presented no difficulty. Walter had scarcely reached the level sands, which were left hard by the retiring tide, than he heard again the same magical voice as before. But now the song was a joyous one, the burthen of it being,
"Join all hands, might and main, weave the sands, form a chain. He, my lover, comes again."
He could not entirely dissuade himself but that he heard this repeated by many voices, but he put the thought aside, referring it, as well he might, to the numerous echoes from the cavernous openings in the cliffs. He reached the eastern side of the dark mass of rocks, from the point of which the tide was slowly subsiding. The song had ceased, and a low moaning sound, the sighing of the wind, passed along the shore. Walter trembled with fear and was on the point of returning when a most flute-like murmur rose from the other side of the rocky barrier, which was presently molded into words.
"From your couch of glistering pearl, slowly, softly come away. Our sweet earth child, lovely girl, died this day, died this day."
Memory told Walter that truly was it the anniversary of Selena Pennaluna's death, and to him every gentle wave falling on the shore sang or murmured,
"Died this day, died this day."
The sand was left dry around the point of the rocks, and Walter, impelled by a power which he could not control, walked onward. The moment he appeared on the western side of the rock, a wild laugh burst into the air as if from the deep cavern before him, at the entrance of which sat the same beautiful being whom he had formerly met. There was now an expression of rare joy on her face, her eyes glistened with delight, and she extended her arms as if to welcome him.
"Was it ever your wont to move so slowly towards your loved one?"
Walter heard it was Selena's voice. He saw it was Selena's features, but he was conscious it was not Selena's form.
"Come, sit beside me, Walter, and let us talk of love."
He sat down without a word and looked into the maiden's face with a vacant expression of fondness. Presently she placed her hand upon his heart. A shudder passed through his frame, but, having passed, he felt no more pain, but a rare intensity of delight. The maiden wreathed her arm around his neck, drew Walter towards her, and then he remembered how often he had acted thus towards Selena. She bent over him and looked into his eyes. In his mind's mirror, he saw himself looking thus into the eyes of his betrayed one.
"You loved her once?"
said the maiden. "I did indeed," answered Walter with a sigh.
"As you loved her, so I love you,"
said the maiden with a smile which shot like a poisoned dart through Walter's heart. She lifted the young man's head lovingly between her hands and, bending over him, pressed her lips upon and kissed his forehead. Walter curiously felt, although he was the kissed, yet that he was the kisser.
"Kisses,"
she said,
"are as true at sea as they are false on land. You men kiss the earth-born maidens to betray them. The kiss of a sea child is the kiss of constancy. You are mine till death."
"Death?" almost shrieked Walter. A full consciousness of his situation now broke upon Walter. He had heard the tales of the gossips respecting the mermaid origin of Selena, but he had laughed at them as an idle fancy. He now felt that they were true. For hours, Walter was compelled to sit by the side of his beautiful tormentor, every word of assumed love and rapture being a torture of the most exquisite kind to him. He could not escape from the arms which were wound around him. He saw the tide rising rapidly. He heard the deep voice of the winds coming over the sea from the far west. He saw that which appeared at first as a dark mist shape itself into a dense black mass of cloud and rise rapidly over the star-bedecked space above him. He saw by the brilliant edge of light which occasionally fringed the clouds that they were deeply charged with thunder. There was something sublime in the steady motion of the storm, and now the roll of the waves which had been disturbed in the Atlantic reached our shores, and the breakers fell thunderingly within a few feet of Walter and his companion. Paroxysms of terror shook him, and with each convulsion he felt himself grasped with still more ardor, and pressed so closely to the maiden's bosom that he heard her heart dancing of joy. At length his terrors gave birth to words, and he implored her to let him go.
The kiss of the sea child is the seal of constancy.
Walter vehemently implored forgiveness. He confessed his deep iniquity. He promised a life of penitence.
Give me back the dead,
said the maiden bitterly, and she planted another kiss, which seemed to pierce his brain by its coldness, upon his forehead. The waves rolled around the rock on which they sat. They washed their seat. Walter was still in the female's grasp, and she lifted him to a higher ledge. The storm approached. Lightning struck down from the heavens to the sands, and thunders roared along the iron cliffs. The mighty waves grew yet more rash and washed up to the strange pair who now sat on the highest pinnacle of the pile of rocks. Walter's terrors nearly overcame him, but he was roused by a liquid stream of fire which positively hissed by him, followed immediately by a crash of thunder which shook the solid earth. Tom Chenall's cottage on the cliff burst into a blaze, and Walter saw from his place amidst the raging waters a crowd of male and female roisterers rush terrified out upon the heath to be driven back by the pelting storm. The climax of horrors appeared to surround Walter. He longed to end it in death, but he could not die. His senses were quickened. He saw his wicked companion and evil adviser struck to the ground, a blasted heap of ashes by a lightning strike, and at the same moment he and his companion were borne off the rock on the top of a mountainous wave on which he floated, the woman holding him by the hair of his head and singing in a rejoicing voice which was like a silver bell heard amidst the deep bass bellowings of the storm.
Come away, o'er the waters wild. Our earthborn child died this day. Come away. The tempest aloud weaves the shroud for him who did betray. Come away. Beneath the wave lieth the grave of him we slay. Come away. He shall not rest in earth's own breast for many a day. Come away, by billows tossed from coast to coast, like deserted boat, his course shall float around the bay.
Myriads of voices on that wretched night were heard amidst the roar of the storm. The waves were seen covered with a multitudinous host who were tossing from one to the other the dying Walter Trewoof, whose false heart thus endured the vengeance of the mermaid, who had, in the fondness of her soul, made the innocent child of humble parents the child of her adoption. The best sentence in this story is, "It was, however, but too evident that this young man was his own idol, and that he expected everyone to bow down with him and worship it." Dang. So, was Selena really a changeling? The very conclusion of this story seems to imply that the mermaid simply loved her and looked over her. But then there's the earlier story that she had jumped into the waves as a child and returned transformed, and the mermaid looks and sounds just like her. Obviously, it's meant to be ambiguous, but I lean toward her being a mermaid changeling. She doesn't like going to church. She always gets carried away when she's bathing in the sea. And she's utterly beautiful, but her face is vacant, lacking animation and mental fire. That all sounds very mermaid-like to me. I admit that this story is the first time I've ever heard of mermaid changeling children as opposed to fairy changeling children. But of course, what is amazing about this story is the relentless, fatal kisses of the mermaid and the way she embraces Walter to his death, laughing and singing the whole time, her heart beating with joy. It's wonderful and terrible and incredibly creepy. By the way, if you do like that kind of creepy, threatening, what exactly is she element of this story, you should listen to The Woman at Seven Brothers, which I will link at the end screen of this video. I also think it's interesting that Chanal gets blasted to ashes by lightning while Walter gets this slower, more terrible drowning. Chanal is really the villain of the story. He's the organizer and orchestrator of all of the evil. He's Iago, right? And Walter is just a weaker version of Othello. It seems like Chanal should have the more severe punishment. On the other hand, there's actually something very appropriate about that ending because the mermaids are not dishing out justice, to each their appropriate punishment. They are doling out vengeance, and their vengeance is greatest on the one whom they watched deceive and destroy the girl they loved. It's also kind of fitting that it was, in a way, love that destroyed Selena, so this other kind of love destroys Walter. We've had a few stories on this channel edited by Robert Hunt, the mineralist and the scientist and the pioneer in photography who collected and edited the stories in this book. In the introduction, he talks about how fascinated he'd always been with Cornish folklore and how quickly it was disappearing even in his day and how he wanted to preserve it. As a person with such a range of interests and accomplishments in these diverse areas, it is perhaps fitting that he also wrote a book called The Poetry of Science, in which he aims to explain scientific concepts in a philosophical and aesthetic way. Of course, in the Victorian era, there was such an explosion of discovery and invention, and there was kind of a belief that the stern rationalism of science would drive away the beauty and the mystery and the, poetry from the world. So he appeals in this book, as we still do today, to the natural world as the sort of fulcrum that balances both science and art, that the natural harmony of the organization of an atom or the beautiful patterns of the world that replicate themselves at every scale are a kind of poetry. The Public Domain Review has a great article about this book and also about Robert Hunt. I will link to it in the description below. And also, if you don't know the Public Domain Review, get to know them. Anyone who likes the weird old stories on this channel will love their work. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. This week's confession is book plates. Guys, how amazing are they? That PDR article about Robert Hunt included this beautiful book plate, and it got me all on this huge sidetrack. I just love the idea of sort of becoming an adult of property and starting to build your personal library. So you go to an engraver or whatever, and you get them to make you your own ex libris with your coat of arms or your monogram or a design that reflects your personality. They are so beautiful and interesting and diverse, and I actually want one of my own. My physical book situation is pretty sad at the moment, but it won't always be. And in recent years, I've been working on making books or making various book-shaped things, and I think it would be lovely to have a unique label of some kind for them. I also got in a huge thing a couple of years ago about swan marks because I think they're also really beautiful and fascinating. Swan marks are these brands, basically, that would be scarred onto the bills of swans to identify their owners. Swans basically don't live or breed well in captivity, so in England they came up with this idea of marking their bills so you could let them roam and breed freely but still know who they belonged to. And so then there was an official register, like the one I'm putting on screen, that depicted the design and noted who it belonged to. These designs are just fascinating to me. They kind of combine what is aesthetically interesting about heraldry with what is aesthetically interesting about tribal tattoos. I don't know where I'm going with this, actually. Do any of you guys share my fascination with this type of old design? If you've listened this far, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. At Restored Lore, I find old, odd, obscure stories and I share them with you. Please help support the channel also by liking this video and dropping me a comment or sharing it with a friend. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.